Now it's a great pleasure to introduce John Chisholm. He holds a degree from the MIT and an MBA from Harvard. He's an entrepreneur. He runs his company, Chisholm Ventures. And on a personal side, he's the new and probably deadliest enemy of the Spanish train public transportation.
Buongiorno. And Professor Colombato, thank you for that very clear exposition. I hope to get a transcript of what you've just said. Am I on here? Let's see.
That's it.
I feel a very great affinity for Italy. My mother's father, Carlo Di Giuni, was born in Pizzigatoni near Cremona in 1881. He moved to the U.S. when he was 28 in 1909 and became a U.S. citizen in 1922 when my mother, Elda Di Giuni, was 3 years old. In 2011, I visited Cascina Nuova, the communal farm in Pizzigatoni in which my grandfather, Carlo, was born. 7 people lived together in a small one-room apartment with a loft. Carlo, his 2 older siblings, his parents, and his father's parents. Carlo's parents, my mother's grandparents, could neither read nor write. Luigi Di Giuni and Maria Beltrano were the parents. A century later, I became the first male in my family to get a college degree. My mother, incidentally, turns 95 this coming June, and she still does her own cooking, driving, and shopping. In any event, why has mankind made such tremendous progress in the last 130 years? Luigi and Mariana Di Giuni knew nothing of telephones, airplanes, washing machines, air conditioning, computers, the internet, or iPhones. And I don't know anyone who would choose to live as in 1881 as compared to all the conveniences we enjoy today. The creativity and innovations of many men and women over the decades have made those conveniences possible. I do think the answer to this question of progress touches on our topic today, which is centralization and decentralization. Interestingly, the amount of government required for a society to enjoy rapid improvements in the quality of life seems to be very small. The 2 most important things government can do, it appears, is to protect the fruits of men's and women's creativity and labor, and thus provide incentives for them to create and produce, and to trade so that they can exchange their productivity and labor for that of others. I'm not a political analyst or even an economist, but rather an engineer and a serial entrepreneur. You know much more about my grandparents' home today, Cremona, and the EU than I do. For the last 30 years, I've lived and worked thousands of miles away in what I think is a very exciting place, namely Silicon Valley in the San Francisco Bay Area of California. The Silicon Valley is the home to such familiar names as Apple, Google, Facebook, HP, Intel, Genentech, Salesforce, Twitter, Yelp, and many others. In the last 30 years there, I've worked for large and small companies alike and founded, grown, and sold 2 software companies of my own. So my thoughts on economics and government are not those of a politician or scholar, but rather as practitioner and observer. Can the phenomenal growth of Silicon Valley in the last half century into the #1 high technology center in the world tell us anything about centralization and decentralization in general, or the EU specifically? I think it can. First to understand is that Silicon Valley has arisen organically over many decades. The Valley's first major high-tech company, Hewlett-Packard, spun out of Stanford in the late 1930s. Over time, the region attracted other companies and entrepreneurs. Most of these failed. Some of them prospered, and a few grew large enough to spin off new companies and entrepreneurs themselves. Silicon Valley was not designed or planned, nor could it have been. There, as elsewhere, growth in economic activity and jobs comes from the companies that survive and grow, and these are a small minority of the companies that are founded there. Though Silicon Valley may appear to be a smoothly running machine from afar, it is a hugely turbulent and unpredictable place up close. In her book, A Regional Advantage, Professor Annalise Saxenian analyzes Silicon Valley's growth, and in particular, looks at why the valley overtook Route 128, which is the high-tech industrial region surrounding Boston, Massachusetts, which got started decades before Silicon Valley. Well, just as Silicon Valley has two world-class universities, Stanford and Berkeley, so does Boston, namely Harvard and MIT. But while Route 128 was mainly populated with highly vertically integrated companies like Honeywell Digital Equipment and Wang and Prime, computer companies that made everything from disk drives to CPUs, Silicon Valley companies were much more atomic. They had many separate companies making disk drives, separate from terminals, from operating systems, from microprocessors, from disk controllers. Silicon Valley tended to use many more off-the-shelf components. So the competition was much more direct, at a smaller scale, and more intense. Most of Boston's computer companies have long disappeared. These centralized companies had the advantages of economies of scale, but could not adapt when technology shifted first from minis to PC networks, and then later from PC networks to mobile devices. In contrast, the more decentralized networks of component suppliers and systems integrators in Silicon Valley were more resilient and could more readily adapt as market conditions changed. Taking a cue from this, I think we should be concerned that by centralizing too much decision-making in Brussels, the EU similarly risks making Europe less able to adapt and less resilient. Two other factors I would mention contributing to Silicon Valley's success are acceptance of failure and a history of successes, which together attract capable and ambitious people from all over, and capital, both venture capital and angel capital, for investment. Regarding failure, people understand that failure is often the fastest way to learn, and that the probability of having one or more failures before your first success is very high. Having worked for at least one failed startup is so common, it's just no big deal. Regarding successes, everyone's heard of the huge IPOs like Google and Facebook, but realize that for every one of those huge successes, there are hundreds or thousands of much smaller liquidity events that spread wealth very broadly across the region. This has given rise to both a vibrant venture capital and tens of thousands of smaller scale angel investors like me who help new companies get off the ground through small scale funding. So these are the biggest factors contributing to Silicon Valley's success, in my view. The biggest obstacle to entrepreneurship, both in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, is regulation. In most respects, starting a new company has become easier thanks to technology. Software has become more functional and smarter. Many services are now available free online. Skills can be learned free through online courses. But one main thing has made starting a business harder, and that's government regulation. One small example. Satisfying the U.S. Internal Revenue Service that a contractor is a contractor rather than an employee often requires a tax specialist or attorney, or having another firm hire the contractor for you as an employee and contract that person to you, a significant management burden and expense in either case. There are many other regulations that burden entrepreneurship as well. Minimum wages, equal opportunity, American with disabilities, occupational safety and health. I could go on and on. Added to these are myriad state, local, and industry-specific regulations. Here's a soundbite for anyone who's tweeting. Simple laws are not necessarily good, but complex laws are almost certainly bad. I understand that the EU is promulgating an average of 17 new regulations every day. That is also reason for concern. To slow the pace of innovation in a company, industry, or society, the best way is to externally regulate it, or better, nationalize it. We cannot predict very far ahead along which dimensions and in which directions technology will evolve. Regulations enacted today block innovations in dimensions we can't even see yet. And regulations are cumulative, raising more and more obstacles to innovation all the time. We forget that markets are already naturally regulated by such laws as supply and demand and word of mouth. Imposing top-down regulations on top of these natural regulations creates a legal morass of uncertainty and cost and concentrates wealth in the hands of the few who can afford the best legal and financial advice, are suitably connected, or sufficiently influential to seek and win favorable interpretations or exemptions. The effects of both regulation and nationalization are hugely insidious because only under very special circumstances can we see how negatively they are affecting our quality of life. Those very special circumstances are natural experiments, for example, East and West Germany or North and South Korea. No one would want to live in the conditions of the former East Germany or North Korea today. We can see those differences clearly. But most of the time, we can't see how much state control of businesses and services negatively affects our quality of life, because there is no alternative or experimental control. As Bastiat said, how much better we could be living under freedom is unseen. So please, whenever anyone suggests that our product or service should be regulated, or worse, nationalized, very deliberately think of East versus West Germany or North versus South Korea. A new school of economics known as complexity economics is providing new insights about economics. Economies, like the environment and the human brain, all complex systems, are not and cannot be designed or controlled top-down. Instead, order in them emerges bottom-up. If you try to centrally control prices, for example, you get shortages or surpluses. Rather, prices emerge from the interactions of thousands of buyers and sellers. This large-scale order arising from the interactions of many independent agents, whether buyers and sellers in the economy, species in an ecosystem, or neurons in the brain, is the primary feature of complex systems. They have other features in common too. They evolve unpredictably and often non-linearly. Growth can happen unexpectedly and exponentially, as we've seen in such companies as Google and Facebook. Complex systems often have chaotic elements, which means arbitrarily small differences in initial conditions can lead to large differences in outcomes. So we simply can't predict or control who the winners or losers will be. Venture capitalists are very well informed, yet still typically lose money on 6 or out of 10 investments. 20 years ago, Microsoft was accused by the US Department of Justice of having monopoly. Today, Microsoft Windows has lost so much market share to Apple and mobile devices that no one would so accuse them today. Another feature of complex systems is that they are dynamic, never at equilibrium. People with unique knowledge and skills are always entering and leaving the workforce. New products and services are constantly being introduced and obsoleted. New competitors are constantly arising, and new technologies and innovations are making it possible to satisfy human needs and creating new needs at the same time. Anyone who thinks that the economy is ever at equilibrium is looking at a static snapshot rather than a full motion video of the economy. Another feature of complex systems is unpredictable consequences of interventions. If you try to set minimum wages, you get unemployment and further encourage innovation and investment in software development and robotics. In the US, we have seen huge unintended consequences of Obamacare, companies shifting their workforces from full-time to part-time. So what can the EU do? Bureaucrats may think that having a vibrant economic ecosystem is like growing crops on a farm, but no. It is much more akin to the natural growth of a dense, profuse jungle. Unlike uniform land farming that might grow predictably, a jungle has no design at all except the right climate and environment to let it grow. And it takes decades, not years. So it's important to start putting in place the right climate and environment today. Here are some specific suggestions. 1, encourage tax structures that enable successful entrepreneurs in the EU to keep more of their gains than elsewhere and thus attract them to the EU. Look how much growth Dubai has enjoyed in the last 2 decades. No personal taxes there. I recently invested in a company, Fido Labs, a leader in natural language processing that moved its headquarters to the US from Gdansk, Poland. Moving companies across borders is easier every year. If Poland wants to keep such companies in Poland, they will increasingly have to create a more attractive tax and regulatory environment than not just other countries in the EU, but other countries around the world, including the US. 2, create a business environment as lightly regulated as possible. Again, we cannot predict very far ahead along which dimensions and directions technology will evolve. A lightweight regulatory environment. And for both regulations and taxes, a good metric that any country might use to measure itself against is the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index. It's a composite of 10 factors, ease of starting a business, registering property, and so forth. Italy currently ranks 65th on the list out of about 190 countries. Here's a challenge to Italy. Consider a very specific goal, like cutting Spain's rank in half in the next 5 years. That is, by 2019, from 65 to 33. Third, I often hear ambassadors and economic ministers talk about how they're providing immediate tax incentives or identifying the jobs of the future. I call these measures economic theater. Window dressing, a Potemkin village. Such superficial measures make officials look good and the public feel good, but they will not accomplish significant long-term good. A few individual high-profile companies do not make an ecosystem. Most of the jobs that will be in demand 10 years from now have not even been created yet. Providing a healthy, competitive environment in which they can evolve faster than elsewhere is needed. So, to be here with you in Italy 133 years after my grandfather was born here gives me a sense of coming full circle. Thank you for including me. And to summarize, let's support the EU to the extent that it ensures free trade among its member states. Let's challenge the EU to the extent that it centralizes rather than distributes decision-making, forces regulations rather than letting standards emerge naturally, and tries to control the complex, dynamic, and unpredictable economy of Europe from the top down. Grazie.